Turning to peace and security, when 50 nations gathered in San Francisco in 1945 to sign the UN Charter, it was determined that they would try to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war by working together to maintain international peace and security. And the U.S. is just as committed to that goal today as it was in 1945. As you know, today over 100,000 peacekeepers from more than 100 nations are making great sacrifices to keep warring parties apart, protect civilians, secure humanitarian corridors, and monitor ceasefires, and restore essential services. And deploying some of those forces in some of the most remote areas of the world is some of the most daunting tasks we face, how you actually really do it. But we are committed to really trying to improve both the quality and quantity of troops in the field and ensuring that they have the right equipment to do the job that they're sent out to do. And as you know, the United States already has helped train and equip over 75,000 peacekeepers and will continue to assist the United Nations in its efforts to get peacekeepers to their missions. The UN also works proactively on the outbreak of crises. As you know, the Department of Political Affairs has a new mediation support standby team, which could be one of the UN's most effective tools for early crisis response. And you probably spent some time talking about prevention and response today. And as you know, UN missions have played a crucial role in ending many conflicts over the last 20 years. And from these experiences, we've actually learned a great deal, and maybe you in this room have helped learn those lessons and draw them out. We've learned a lot about making mediation effective, the results enduring, and including that the mediation capabilities are built into peace building and peacekeeping efforts. As you know, DPA also dispatches special representatives of the Secretary General to the missions and supports them with political, security, economic, and humanitarian responses to complex problems. As you know, in places such as Iraq, the SRSG serves as the principal advisor to the government on a number of crucial areas, including national and regional elections, repatriation of the hundreds of thousands of refugees, and the internally displaced people. In Afghanistan, the SRFG is leading the UN efforts to help rebuild the country's civil society infrastructure, and is really the center of that effort. I'd like quickly to turn, and in Q&A we can go into greater detail, I'd like to quickly turn from peace and security to human rights and human security. As you know, the United States has recently announced its candidacy for the Human Rights Council. When we announced our candidacy, the Secretary Clinton said, quote, "Human rights are an essential element of American global foreign policy. With others, we'll engage in the work of improving the UN human rights system to advance the vision of the UN Declaration of Human Rights," end quote. And as you know, America's deep commitment to human rights is driven by the founding values of our nation, the conviction that international peace and security and prosperity are strengthened when human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected and protected. And we're going to take our commitment to live up to these ideals very seriously. We'll continue to work with international partners in a spirit of openness, consultation, and respect. And indeed, expressions of concern about human rights and the human rights situation in any country, including our own, are appropriate matters for international discussion. The U.S. is also strongly committed to pursuing the goals of the Millennium Declaration in September 2000. We have large-scale and innovative programs focusing on poverty eradication, health, education, and development challenges, and as you know, the administration supports the Millennium Development Goals. At the same time, we've also learned a lot about what works, and it's essential to have a comprehensive development strategy on how to achieve these goals. A committed, transparent, and accountable national government with a well-designed national plan is crucial to creating and enabling an environment of opportunities that foster and support sustainable growth. One important aspect of this is nurturing future generations. And the U.S., as you know, provides strong support to the United Nations Children's Fund, and we're looking at ways to intensify our cooperation with UNICEF in pursuit of the common goal to give children a better life. And UNICEF has had major successes in actually advancing particularly some of the health-related Millennium Development Goals, particularly looking at the drop in mortality rates for children under 5. But the investment in people also requires a deep commitment to education, and the administration attaches great importance to helping countries achieve UNESCO's Education for All goals. And many of you know I've spent a lot of my life at various points working on UNESCO issues, so it's good to be back on that. UNESCO has been instrumental in drawing attention to the action to the problems of illiteracy, both for youth and adults. And next month, UNESCO will host the International Conference on Adult Education. But while we also can talk about improving human well-being, we also want to look at the larger global systems on which our international society rests. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the administration's commitment to climate change, but we can also talk about other environmental issues as well. As you know, President Obama is committed to addressing the urgent issues of global climate change, and the U.S. recognizes its responsibility as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and we intend to be a leader on this issue. Solutions to the climate crisis are both domestic and global, and every country will need to make a contribution if we're to address this problem. The administration is committed to working with international partners to reach a strong international climate change agreement and to harness efforts by all major emitters. And we look forward to working with the international community, both in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in those negotiations, and in other fora to tackle these issues. And as you know, on Monday, the U.S. will actually host a meeting of the Major Economies Forum for Energy and Climate Change to advance this agenda. But also in our purview are many of what we call the technical agencies and the specialized agencies. And the specialized agencies of the UN also help inform and advance the shared interests of its international partners. And particularly thanks to the legal and practical regimes we look that also fall into my purview. We look at the International Civil Aviation Organization, International Maritime Organization for Aviation and Maritime Issues, as well as the ITU and many of the other issues that help sustain the global systems. I just touched on very briefly, but as you gather, we have ambitious goals. And indeed, never before has so much been expected of the United Nations. And as a result, never before has management reform and improving effectiveness also been crucial. The UN's reputation and credibility are among its most critical assets and some of its most vulnerable ones as well. At times, inefficiency and mismanagement and corruption have tainted the UN's work. Therefore, it's crucial that the UN activities are given adequate oversight. And the UN's Office of Internal Oversight Services is the only effective means really for managing the audit issues. And we know that the Secretary takes its reports seriously. In a sense, we are trying to move to a culture focusing on results. And this is particularly important when public finances are strapped. But the UN can do well with the resources it has. And without more information on the effectiveness and the impact of the UN's programs, member states cannot make educated decisions about the strategic directions and the apportionment of limited resources. That said, we want to be sure that the Secretary General has the tools that he needs to manage the organization. In closing, I'd like to, in advancing U.S. interests throughout the UN system is one of the highest priorities of this administration. That's why I'm particularly excited to be doing this portfolio now, that it's taking on such an importance in the administration's foreign policy. Indeed, spreading peace, security, and prosperity, and hope are best accomplished by mutual engagement. And all nations have a stake in making the UN more relevant and effective so that we may turn to its help, international help, with our most important and difficult global problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you make us feel very good with that statement, and you touch on so many of the issues we've been discussing. I'll resist my own temptation to ask you first question and open it up because we have so many good people here. James, you want to identify yourself? Do we have a microphone down here?
Stephen Schlesinger from the Century Foundation. The Obama administration has proposed paying up its peacekeeping dues, but there's been historic resistance in the Congress to sort of repaying that debt. What are you planning to do to get that bill through? And second of all, how do you change the attitude of Congress on the Hill, which has, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, been resistant to helping the U.S. in its dues obligations overall to the UN? Thank you.
Thank you. As you suggest, that actually meeting our treaty commitments to pay our dues is a partnership between the administration and the legislature. And indeed, the administration has included and looking at funding in its supplemental for 2009 to have some funding to deal with the arrears. And the administration is very much committed to try to deal with the arrears it cannot be done all at once, but I think we want to be moving in that direction. And I think there's been something of a sea change. I mean, if I compare the conversation on UN arrears issues now and when I first started doing this, 15, 16 years ago, there really is a different atmosphere. And I think that our congressional colleagues really are also interested in how we actually make the UN effective. Hence the comment on making sure that they feel that we're making sure that the money's being spent well. But I think there's a new interest to actually talk very pragmatically about how you move in a systematic way to address the arrears question. And we realize that we have, we understand our treaty obligations and we want to meet them. And I think it'll be a multi-year plan. I expect each year I'll be up there trying to work hard on that.
Yes, the gentleman right there.
Hi, Harry Blaney, Center for International Policy. I want to ask one question, which is, of course, on the minds of many people these days, and that is the UN and Sudan, and particularly Darfur. It seems to me that one of the great tests, and this has been discussed here, is if that Americans need to see the UN succeed in things, and particularly given the American concerns and attitudes on humanitarian and issues of genocide. And yet we've been dithering, if I may use my own personal view, on a solution there as people die. And I was wondering whether there is a solution on the part of the Obama administration that is different than we did before, which is essentially to agree and then basically have agreements broken down, more people killed, and no action taken on the ground that in fact stops the disaster that's there. So I'd be very interested in hearing if you've got the answer to this conundrum and what approaches on how to bring together this either in the UN or if you are thinking about other alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you. I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to assume I have the answer. No one person has the answer, but maybe I can comment just on a slice of moving towards a solution. Indeed, Darfur is one of the most difficult situations that we face. And indeed, now there is a operation there, UNIMID there, which has not been able to deploy yet to its full strength. And one of the areas to focus on is trying to get that deployment to the full strength that's actually been mandated. And that's what we can focus very practically on trying to make sure those who are committed actually get there. But you point to a larger question on making sure that the American public at large sees success. And I think we need to also look around the globe at the number of operations. I mean, Darfur is one of the toughest, but there are actually many operations. If we look at MINUTSA in Haiti, we look at in Liberia, we look at operations that have actually been part of helping build long-term peace and building a transition. And they're playing crucial roles. They're not always in the headlines, but there are many operations that are actually doing the day-to-day work of helping political and social processes occur and are providing the space for that. So we also need to highlight those when we think about all of peacekeeping, although a lot of our time will go to the hard cases. But we also have to acknowledge all the things that are being done around the globe. They're actually part of really building solid peace and security and a role that no one else can really do. And the peacekeeping operations can do that.
One more, I think.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I'm do
She's
back
got
here.
an important meeting,
Yes,
and I don't want her to miss it.
I got out of the building on the condition that I would get back in time, so I apologize to be here.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. George Lopez, University of Notre Dame.
Yes.
To be effective in peacekeeping, some say we need a more permanent, more professional force. This is one of those areas where there's a great deal done in the scholarly and policy world. Is this an idea whose time may have come, at least for deep engagement, if not support in the Obama administration?
Well, as you say, there's been lots of creative thinking about all sorts of different standby mechanisms and so forth, and many different models over the years. What I'd say at this point, in terms of, I think we're really focusing on really practical measures to try to enhance the system we have, and in terms of both how we write the mandates, how we engage the troop contributing states, how we actually equip them and train them and get them into the field. I think we're focusing on that. But then, as you know, there are enough ongoing reports, as you know, the UN itself is doing its own report examining peacekeeping. So we'll want to see again what they're focusing on, because we want to say where's the really places where an engagement by member states could actually bring real benefit in the near term to actually making these operations practical, deployable, and effective.
We do. I promised us we would not keep her from her meeting, but I want to thank you so much, and we will be bringing to you the results of this conference as we write it up, and we wish you all the success in the world.
Princeton, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You may have noticed, and I will be introducing him formally later, but we're very honored to have James Leach with us, who is going to make the closing remarks of our conference today, and thank you very much for being here. But now, at the next step on this, I want to hear from the leaders of each of the 3 breakout sessions to get what you came up with in terms of solving all the problems we talked about in the first part of the day. So if we could get the leaders of that coming up, and let's see, what order am I going to take it in?
Teresa's first.
James, you can. I don't want to put you out. Okay. Teresa, do you want to begin?
Sure. Our session, Breakout Session 1, was looking at relations between the United States and other Western states and the G77. And the question we were asked to look at was, is a grand bargain on UN reform possible? There were 2 different approaches to this session. The first would have been to say no and go and have some more coffee, but we resisted the temptation. So we said no and kept working to come up with a slightly more optimistic scenario. I think a lot of the issues outlining the very deep divisions within the United Nations General Assembly on a whole range of issues, ranging from human rights, R2P, peace and security, more the priorities of the North, to the economic and social and other priorities of the countries from the South, with a broad and inadequate overgeneralization, came up from this morning's conversation. Also, we picked out from this morning the fact that the institutional alignment, both within the General Assembly and in some of the other formal bodies in the UN, really, in the next few years, doesn't make the prospect of a grand bargain very possible, both the legacies of the divisions of recent years and the incoming president of the General Assembly being from Libya. The chair of the G77 at the moment is Sudan. The head of the executive committee of UNDP is Iran. This is a complicated set of conditions. The good news, however, despite that terrain, is, of course, and as we've just heard from Assistant Secretary Brimmer, it is easy to say that the good news and the great opportunity that is presented by the new administration, and also the silver lining in the cloud of a number of different crises that the administration is facing. Obviously the financial crisis, also the gravity of issues of climate change and other environmental questions. These may actually, taken together, create opportunities. And I think if there was a central point that came out of our discussion, it was that what we need to look for are partial bargains, or not partial bargains, but kind of sectoral specific, substance specific bargains and cooperation on concrete issues in different fora of the UN that then may help improve the overall climate of relations within the broader forums of the UN. Among the obvious pluses are not just the positions, public positions taken by the administration that we've heard, but the style that has been projected by President Obama's statements and approach to diplomacy at all. Not just his statements on a new age of engagement, but visible and evident sides of taking a more consultative approach to diplomacy. One of the points that came up was the rather old-fashioned style of diplomacy at the United Nations, and actually the value of courtesy, diplomatic courtesy within the UN, which the US hasn't always shown in recent times, and sometimes can create enemies where it isn't necessarily needed. On the opportunities for moving ahead with repercussions for relations within the UN, the G20 and the movement of the G20, though very separate from the UN, the movement that may indicate towards revitalizing and reforming the IFEs is something that was seen as positive in a UN context as well. The prospects of the upcoming convention on climate change and the pressing demands of climate change being areas where kind of variable geometry of member states may find ways of working together. Non-proliferation, similarly disarmament, will be very difficult when it gets to the nitty-gritty, but offers concrete tasks and areas to work on. I was personally very pleased to hear the Assistant Secretary devote so much time to peacekeeping and seem to be so on top of that brief. I see, and this came up in our discussion, a lot of opportunities for peacekeeping, not just to improve peacekeeping as a win-win solution for everybody. If the UN is better at peacekeeping, then all states win. But the particular dynamics of peacekeeping as they've developed in recent years has created a kind of almost peacekeeping apartheid structure where the Security Council authorizes peacekeeping operations, but the peacekeeping troops are largely from developing countries, South Asia in particular. And things have got rather out of balance, and there's dissatisfaction amongst the conditions and terms and mandates of peacekeeping among some of those troop contributors. So a move and an effort and a kind of muscle put into fixing peacekeeping, improving peacekeeping, as we've just heard, will not only improve peacekeeping, but will provide, I think, a very fertile area for cooperation amongst the variety of member states who are involved in different ways. One institutional entity that didn't come up in this morning's discussion but was mentioned was the Peacebuilding Commission, where the configuration of member states, the Peacebuilding Commission itself, I think, is 31 member states, and then the countries on its agenda have their own special country configurations, which involve the states themselves, the regional actors, those with an interest, as well as the outside big powers and donors. The Peacebuilding Commission has been, as you all know, quite slow to get going and not uncontroversial, but has made important strides forward. And I think those fora have represented useful ways of bridging some of the divisions that in other fora have come to the fore, and offer a positive framework for the future as well. I think the next year or two will be critical. Probably 2009 is a critical moment for peacekeeping because of the various initiatives underway, both within the Security Council and from inside the Secretariat. So that's a moment of real opportunity, which I know the administration is hoping to seize, and I think the more it can be encouraged to do so is the better. Another marker point, a sort of signpost that the group identified as an opportunity, is the review of the MDGs, which is due in 2010. Again, hearing the administration's commitment to the MDG goals, and the more the more that can be done on that, the better. I think not just for the verifiable good of the MDGs themselves, but also for the perception of the US amongst other states. Clearly, a worry in terms of the MDG review process is what the impact of the financial crisis will be on the MDGs by the time we get there. But a commitment by the United States, if one thing that was cited was if the United States is able to keep its commitment to double aid to Africa, for example, by then, will be of huge practical and also symbolic, but a real importance in terms of combating poverty, but also have a diplomatic and political importance beyond that, given the importance to the membership. There was also some discussion, and this may be something in which some of the members of the Breakout group can develop further on if there's time, but to the importance of innovative engagement by civil society organizations with the UN outside the formal structures of the GA and the Security Council, civil society platforms on issues such as technology and a host of other issues that can help break down the inbuilt oppositions in the more formal structures and provide new avenues for engagement and new opportunities for extending services and attention to G77 countries. I think I will stop there. We had a brief discussion of the Security Council reform, but I know that is very much in Stewart's breakout session, so I won't tread on his toes, and we'll stop there. Thank you.
We have time for just a few questions or comments that anybody has on this panel's conclusions.
or if any of the panel feel that I misrepresented things really badly, then you better speak up, including yourself, actually.
No, I thought you did wonderfully. Yes, Ed, please.
Ed Almondar from the UN Association. Would you care to rank some of the opportunities you put up for the Obama administration in terms of importance and or feasibility?
I think I think this is. I mean, I see as I think the financial package, the revitalising the IFIs, will perhaps be the one that is most likely to happen soonest because of the immediate demands of the financial crisis. I have an open question, but it's more my question than anybody else's about whether that will help or hinder full progress on issues such as climate change. There's a possibility it might go either way, and so I would see. I think it will be for the perception of international architecture, particularly by emerging powers. Revitalization of the IFIs is not just hugely important; it's essential right now. And the G20 was a positive move in that direction. It's not, as Ambassador Pickering made clear, and I entirely agree, it's not a mechanism or a structure that can extend to the UN range overall. There's only one African state on it, for just to start off with. But it's an important move. I see the peacekeeping. Peacekeeping, as we've heard throughout today, is a huge benefit to the US, the UN's peacekeeping, and it was great to hear the Assistant Secretary talking about, Liberia and Haiti and things which are not at the top of the pile, but and in places where the UN is particularly useful to the US. And I always felt even during the past 8 years, it was kind of never mentioned, but everybody working on it knew that utility remained, but nobody really mentioned it much. But those officials in and out of the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping's office knew that. So that is, I think, at this moment, putting some intense effort into peacekeeping will pay off. It's possible to get peacekeeping better, though not easy. And in the long term, it's hard to prioritize them, but for the UN politics, getting the MDG review meeting right, or getting a good MDG review meeting in 2010, particularly after the mess of 2005, would be a really good thing. I mean, it would be a good thing for the MDGs, but it would be a good thing at other levels as well.
Okay, I think we'll move. Thank you very much, Teresa. And now we're going to move to the second session on challenge of budgetary management reform, and David Behrman.
Thank you, Princeton. Our discussion was focused almost entirely on the issue of the North-South conflict as it relates to the impasse on accomplishing budgetary and management reform. And in that regard, we focused on the issue of managing for results, the assumption being that if the UN could put in place an effective system for managing by results, then this would alleviate some of the concerns that the South has expressed about entrusting the Secretary General with more authority over the Secretariat, because the General Assembly would be in a position to hold the Secretariat accountable for the results of his performance, the performance of the Secretariat. That immediately, of course, led to a discussion about how does one measure results. We're dealing with measuring results in the public sector, so there's no P&L. And it's in an international environment, which means that the objectives are even more difficult to state with specificity, let alone measure. There has been in place now for some time a professed commitment, at least, to managing for results in the UN. But I think it's widely regarded by all, including the countries of the South, as not having succeeded in accomplishing its objectives. I don't want to suggest, I don't think anybody did, that it's easy, that there are metrics readily to hand that one can identify and then hold the Secretariat accountable. But nonetheless, I think we thought, and some of the people in our group were quite expert in this subject, it is achievable. It's an objective that is achievable. One way of moving forward is to convene a group of experts drawn from throughout the world who have studied this issue of how do you measure performance of the public sector, and even better in the international arena. And I gather there are some success stories that can be drawn upon, particularly in respect of UNDP's performance. Lessons learned in that respect could be very important. And such a system, blessed by the General Assembly, that is to say the creation of this body, and then the reporting of its results, would give the countries of the South a role, a sense of participation in creating this methodology. And then the results would be reported to the General Assembly on an annual or semi-annual basis. Of course, the resolutions would have to be drafted with sufficient specificity so that results could be measured, and that would be one of the recommendations, presumably, that would come out of this process. I was delighted to see that this whole initiative, which preoccupied, I suppose, most of our discussion, is exactly what Secretary Bremer focused on. And in many ways, it's a key. It's a key to unlocking the power struggle that we've described. It's also a key to generating increased support in the United States for the UN, because one would then have the ability to demonstrate to the Congress that the UN actually has accomplished results which would be in our interest as well as in the interests of the rest of the membership. That was the primary issue that we discussed, and that our recommendation would be that the Obama administration should endorse this initiative and probably should press for the convening of an expert body that could actually come up with the metrics that are indispensable. We also talked about the General Assembly, whether the General Assembly could be revitalized or perhaps given a more instrumental role than it's had in a very long time in connection with the governance of the organization at large. I don't know that we came up with any ideas that commanded a consensus, but one thought certainly was that the General Assembly could be the body to convene a discussion on issues of great moment facing the world. For example, while today the issue which preoccupies most of us is the financial crisis, and that's being dealt with in other fora, and I wouldn't propose the General Assembly get engaged in dealing with that. There is the issue of water or food, food in particular, which is a critical issue, not receiving global attention. Why shouldn't the General Assembly, at its very next session, occupy itself with a discussion of that subject and hopefully generate some ideas, suggestions, initiatives, energy to deal with a silent killer, which is going to become even more pronounced as in the months and years to come. And there are other issues that one could identify readily that could be brought before the General Assembly. If there were such an issue that the General Assembly had to consider in the course of its deliberations, then that would crowd out of the agenda. One would expect a lot of the nonsense that's there now, a lot of the repetitive resolutions which really accomplish nothing and have come to turn the General Assembly into an assembly which is mostly concerned with ritual rather than results. We also talked about whether the General Assembly could be given a more meaningful role in the selection of the Secretary General. I don't know that we came into any conclusions about that. The idea of a nominating commission, although I don't know that the General Assembly would play a role in that was articulated this morning by Tom, is one that we would readily endorse. There have been calls. I think the UNA once had a report that suggested that the Security Council propose more than one candidate, which would give the General Assembly a choice. That was discussed, although again, I don't think I could say that it commanded much of a consensus. But the notion of giving the General Assembly a more meaningful role without intruding on the authority of the Security Council is one I think that would make a contribution toward healing the breach between the North and the South. We discussed also the one body in the UN with which a number of us at least are familiar that has no transparency whatsoever and that would benefit from it and plays a key role in the budgetary process, which is the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions, a body of so-called experts that really has very few experts on it and that operates behind closed doors. And its function is to consider, as the title would suggest, administrative questions, budgetary questions, but why does it have to do this in the dark? So we would like to recommend to the administration that it move to make that body a more transparent body, and hopefully that would lead to the selection of people who are more expert, have greater expertise in this area, and also the strengthening of the staff, which is still very overwhelmed by the responsibilities that it has in terms of considering increasingly complicated budgets with a staff of a very meager staff. I think there are only 2. I think that is pretty much what we discussed. If there's anybody on the breakout session committee that has a contribution to make or would like to correct the record, please let me know.
Thank you very much, David. Have time for maybe a question or 2 as well, if people have a question. Yes, Toby.
I was wondering if you could tell us if, when you dealt with the transparency issue, whether there was any discussion saying it should go beyond the 5th Committee into almost all the organizational efforts in the United Nations.
Well, we didn't really discuss transparency in other contexts, but that certainly is a watchword. The transparency, the notion here, the concept is that if the UN Secretariat manages for results which are measurable and reportable, if it does so in a transparent fashion so that the membership will know what's happening and can buy into it, then one would expect a different environment to develop in respect of welcoming management reforms. So we focused on the ACABQ as such, but I think the principle of greater transparency would extend across the board.
Okay, take one more question here.
Did you discuss new ways of raising revenue for the UN, and if so, what's the Tobin tax among those ways?
No, we didn't. We didn't get into that subject at all.
Okay, I think then thanks very much, David. I'm going to move now to Stewart Patrick and the 3rd panel breakout session, Security Council reform. That old issue.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that after 2 strenuous hours, we came to complete agreement on a path forward that will meet with both Pakistani and Indian agreement. No, unfortunately, that is a joke. We had a very stimulating discussion, frank and candid exchange of views, which was really both brought home the imperative for reasons of both legitimacy and some argued efficiency and effectiveness of the Security Council to actually make it look a little bit more like the world as it exists today. But also, I think we remain sort of ran headlong into some of the still similar obstacles that exist today, which include at least 3 that we discussed, which is the indifference or opposition of members of the Security Council, the problems of regional rivalries, and the persistence of bloc politics at the United Nations, which makes it extremely difficult to make any forward headway. We divided our discussion into 4 major baskets of topics. The first was the justification for reform. And here, we thought it was important to start from examining that premise, because one could make the argument that sort of a steady state going on indefinitely might serve certainly U.S. interests better than some reform proposals. But there was a pretty strongly felt view, not just on representation grounds, that is the perceived legitimacy of the organization, but also increasingly in terms of its effectiveness, that at least some incorporation of countries that are capable and that are emerging as some of the world's great powers was essential. It's essential to prevent a legitimation crisis within the world body. It's also essential in some cases to address new threats, because some of the countries under consideration are actually better prepared and more interested in dealing with some of those the new global and transnational threats that we find than keeping them outside of the room doesn't really make sense. And it's also important for reasons of implementation, even if it makes things a little bit more difficult in terms of decision making. The big actors that you need there are ones that have to be at the table. So there was a surprising, I think, degree of consensus that this is an enlargement, including both permanent members and non-permanent members, would ideally be the way to go. Now, in terms of reform options, and in terms of this was the second issue that we discussed was what are the possible reform options, and we reviewed several of the recent efforts along these lines and different options, including the G4 proposals that have been presented by Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil, and also the Uniting for Consensus proposals, as well as different proposals that the African bloc, the AU, had worked on. There was much less consensus here, although I think the notion that that at least the most plausible effort would be some sort of a G4 plus situation. Now, this might have to happen in terms of a transitional arrangement where one had not permanent seats yet, but renewable elected seats, and a transition period that would occur after 15 years or so. The importance here is that any process be dynamic and reflect changes in the distribution of power within, which obviously is something that doesn't exist now within the UN charter system. The idea, we discussed also questions about the veto. It was generally accepted that no permanent member is obviously going to do away with the veto. It's unlikely or implausible that the veto will be extended to any permanent member. There are obviously countries and blocs that have demanded, like particularly African countries, that have demanded having the veto for any permanent member. But that was considered unlikely. It was in terms of criteria of who should be a member. It was seen as very important that that representation should be heavily dependent upon capability and capability to discharge the Article 7 or Chapter 7 obligations of any member of the Security Council. It was, however, and partly because it was seen as just in terms of this gets into the third issue we dealt with, which is breaking the deadlock. I wish I could say that we came up with any optimism about how that deadlock might be broken. There was a sense that the African bloc, which has played either spoiler or kingmaker role in at least getting things out of the General Assembly, was obviously a group that would have to be either split or hived off to in a particular direction to get any movement, at least out of the General Assembly. But in view of the difficulty of moving forward on Security Council reform in the near future, there was some emphasis on what sorts of changes to what the Security Council, its actually method of its working methods, it's the way it conducts a business, what sorts of options might be available along those lines. And here there were a number of proposals, some of which were already discussed in previous plenary sessions, but including the advisory, an advisory council to the Security Council, for instance, of the G4, which I believe is an idea of Princeton's, at least has been attributed to him. And in theory would be created as a subsidiary body to the Security Council. There was also the question of variable geometry, and that I believe was raised in an earlier session, which was the idea of creating subsidiary councils having to do with different particular issue areas with membership dependent on the region or the issue, but having a link with the Security Council. Beyond that, there were notions of rules of procedure and increased transparency, greater opportunity for members of the UN General Assembly to actually, who are not members of the Security Council, to actually have an audience with the Security Council and have regular consultations, more regular briefings by the President of the Security Council. Perhaps advisory bodies, technical bodies, bodies of experts that which the Security Council could draw on to help build up its own, in a sense, institutional capacity, but also permit the outreach and involvement of others in the process. And then finally, a process to track compliance with different aspects, with actual Security Council resolutions that are passed. As I said, there were not a lot of persuasive ideas about how we could actually break the deadlock. And this brings us really to the final point, which is what should the Obama administration do? And I have to say that there was not a lot of belief that this was a winner for the Obama administration in the short term. I think that there was probably a general recognition that at a rhetorical level, being in favor of a Security Council that is more representative and legitimate, representative and reflects the world that we live in, is something that the Obama administration is certainly beyond a record as supporting. But there was a division of opinion as to whether or not this is something that the Obama administration should spend its capital on. Some felt yes. Others wondered whether or not this really had legs. And in general, I think that there was a notion that some sort of an interim solution, as opposed to sort of a full frontal assault on the membership, especially when it comes to permanent membership with the Security Council, was something that was going to be very difficult for the Obama administration to bring off. But again, it was a very diverse. Many diverse perspectives were raised during our very rich discussion. So I'd be happy to be corrected by any members who were there.
Okay, time's a little short, but I'll take one or two questions. Yeah, right here. Do we have a microphone?
Thank you. Excellent summary. Stewart, we ran out of time at the end of the discussion, and to talk about a strategy for perhaps a more ambitious type of reform plan, couldn't we envisage a process toward a summit, say, September in 2010, that would bring, of course, high-level political attention as well as a deadline to unbreak this deadlock that we kept discussing in our group? And we could learn from the 2005 summit, which created the Peacebuilding Commission. And another lesson from that was the composition being not only based on regional representation, but the issue you brought up for better effectiveness, a criteria that could include military, financial, and of course civilian contributions, which would also therefore make middle powers as well as the great powers eligible for membership. Couldn't we at least come to consensus on that criteria?
I think creating some sort of a, I don't know if you want to call it a deadline, but sort of an action-focusing event could conceivably be helpful, as well as establishing some more clear criteria that you're talking about. But I think that will work in getting some countries on board. But the difficulty is really in the regional rivalries area, and also what appears to be right now, it may only be a bargaining tactic, but the quite maximalist AU perspective on two African permanent members with the veto. Again, that may be something that can be worked with. It will also require the G4 members to be, I think, much more flexible on the length of time of their elected renewable seats, and to accept that in principle as opposed to the permanent membership. I think most have sort of given up on the idea of a veto, at least pending a review conference. But it's a fair point. I just think that in and of itself won't overcome the deadlock.
Teresa, you want to make a comment, then we'll have to move on.
Say something very quick and very politically incorrect, which is I think there's a clear advantage to the Obama administration of paying vocal lip service to the rhetorical principle and not pushing it to a crunch, because actually putting a deadline and forcing it through would be a complete train wreck. By all means, on the record, support it every way, and say that the US will respond to whatever proposals the membership brings forward, but don't push it to the edge, because it'll be a mess.
We'll have to move
on. Depressing,
but thank you.
But true.
Thank you all for your presentations. And while we bring the upward and taking place, let me just say a couple comments about the conference before I introduce our final speakers. This conference was the brainchild of Bob Berg and Andy Rice, and a number of people worked very hard on it. Ed Elmendorf and David Birnbaum and Edison Dick, Bob Wilbur, Stewart Patrick, and Daniel Lamote, and perhaps others, Toby Mercuro and others. But I have to say, for someone who had to drop out for a while and came back, that the person who really deserves incredible credit for this, who just worked tirelessly from beginning to end on concept, vision, people, details, and made it all happen, was Andy Rice. And I really think we owe him a tremendous. We're very pleased to have with us Mort Halpern, and Mort, as many I think is well known to many people here, he's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, the executive director also of the Open Society Policy Center, and director of the U.S. Advocacy for the Open Society Institute. He has had many government positions over many years. He's known as an extremely, not only active and principled person, but a very courageous person. He's worked on almost every issue of foreign policy I can think of, and he has been a great advocate on a principled and active role for the United States in international affairs. So, Mort, it's a wonderful pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It is courageous to come in at the end of a meeting. I once was at a conference, and the last speaker was from the organization that had organized the conference, and the subject of the talk was summary of conclusions and recommendations of the conference. And he got up and he said, I want to apologize to those of you who do not find your ideas fully reflected in what I'm going to say. He said, but I actually wrote this draft before the conference began, and I'm going to present it. He then presented a draft which was entirely opposite to everything that was said at the conference, and I fear I run the risk of doing that. I was interested in the discussion about the enlargement of the Security Council, and I agree with the last suggestion. I think this is an issue whose time will, in my view, never come. And I think, for me, it is epitomized by the argument of the Italian government, which, of course, objects to Germany and Japan getting permanent seats unless Italy gets one. And as far as I can tell, the argument is, we lost the war, too. Given the way the UN functions, there's no way to overcome the inevitable logic of that argument. I've been asked, I think, to talk about the role of NGOs and civil society in strengthening the UN, and let me just briefly mention two subjects. One is, I think we are now, unfortunately, as we're all reminded of every day, in a period in which talking about the American engagement with the UN and the international community requires us to start by saying we need to clean our own house. We used to be able to talk about the need for American leadership, taking for granted that we behave the way members of the United Nations are supposed to behave, and the question was, how much did we push other countries not to disappear people, not to torture them, not to do other things which violated the basic principles of the Charter, of the Declaration, and of the Covenant, not to speak about the Convention Against Torture. We are now, unfortunately, reminded every day that we need to clean our own house. And I think the President obviously moved in an important way in his first days in the right direction by terminating many of the policies of the previous administration, which clearly violated our international obligations. But he has also told us many times, and again in the last few days, that he has a desire to move forward and not look back. And I think what that does is to ignore an important set of our international legal obligations. The obligation to combat impunity is now clearly enshrined in our international obligations. And it is also a treaty obligation in the Convention Against Torture to, in fact, prosecute people who tortured people. And I think Nobody who looks at the documents that just came out can fail to conclude that the United States government, as a matter of policy, with the high-level approval of senior officials of the government, tortured people. And we established very clearly at Nuremberg the principle that it didn't matter if you got your lawyers to tell you that it was okay, that it was torture and that you would be punished for it, and that waterboarding was torture was established, if not in the Spanish Inquisition, in the fact that we indicted convicted Japanese for waterboarding, saying it was clearly torture. And so I think part of cleaning our own house, part of making a credible run for the UN Human Rights Council, which the United States has now decided to do, is to say that we intend to meet all of our international obligations, and that means not only stopping doing things that we should never have done, but holding accountable people who did that, both publicly by making clear, in my view is the next step should be a presidential commission that gives us all the facts. Mr. Cheney even seems to want the facts out, and I think that is the one time I would listen to him and get all those memos out. And then I think we need to consider who needs to be indicted and convicted of what clearly, in my view, were crimes. Let me turn very briefly to an entirely different aspect of civil society. My view is that making the UN effective requires persuading the democratic countries of the global south that they are democratic countries and they ought to have a democratic foreign policy. They have been very slow in doing that. The non-aligned movement, as you all know, still exists. I've been trying to find out now for 10 years who they are non-aligned against. And of course, there is no answer, but they do seem to be against Western values. And why at the UN, and in particularly in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, the democratic countries from the global south allow themselves to be led by Egypt, by Pakistan, which, like a body with a slow central service system, the person in Geneva still doesn't know that Pakistan has had a change in government and that there is now a democratic government. One hopes that that cable is on the way and someday it will arrive. But we have Pakistan, Egypt, and then Cuba and Algeria and China and Russia leading an effort of the non-aligned, of the Asian bloc, of the Islamic bloc, and countries that should know better and do in their own capital sometimes do know better, going along with them in making the body one that mostly denounces Israel and which rejects country-specific resolutions, in most cases, on other countries. And I think the key to changing that is civil society in the global south. These countries are democratic, and that means they have civil societies that function. And I think the task of our civil society needs to be to try to encourage and strengthen what is a developing movement in the global south of human rights organizations being concerned about the foreign policy of their country. That is a new and extraordinary move for them. They all live in countries where they know they have serious internal human rights problems, and therefore their focus has been largely on trying to deal with their own internal human rights problems. And many of them have not known until you go to them and start talking to them about it, that their own government misbehaves in Geneva and New York in dealing with human rights issues. And I think what we need to do is to find people in those countries who understand the importance of that issue, strengthen the organizations that deal with those questions so that we begin to put pressure on the democratic governments of the global south to behave like democratic governments. And then the United States needs to learn again to listen, to cooperate with other people, to work with the European Union and other countries from the north, and as well as with the democratic countries in the global south, and to create within the UN an effective majority of democratic states that can deal in an even-handed manner with the human rights problems in every country and with the other problems that affect peace and security, but do so from a democratic perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. We have time for just a question or two if people have them or comment. Anybody want to? Mort, let me just ask you one quick question on this, because it seems to me you've raised a very important point. Is that a role for civil society here to link up? And what do you think the backlash might be from trying to do that?
Well, Western civil society, particularly American civil society, faces the same problem that the U.S. government faces when you try to get something done in the world. If the U.S. government takes the lead, everybody says, well, this is the Americans just pushing everybody around again, and we're not going to go along with it. If the U.S. lays back, then they say, well, there's no way this is going to get done, because it can't get done without the active U.S. leadership in the issues. I've been involved from the beginning with the organization called the Community of Democracies, and you get exactly this. The convening group members say, well, we can't let the Americans push us around, and then they say, well, we can't decide what to do till the Americans tell us what to do. And I think in Western civil society, we face the same problem. If we try to tell civil society in the global south what to do, they will rebel. If we don't, they have problems of fundraising, since most of the money is here, and they have problems of legitimating an alliance. And so a number of us from various organizations in the United States have been engaged in a very slow, complicated process, which we hope is gradually leading to an effective coalition of NGOs from the Global South. But it's very complicated for that reason.
Thank you. I'm going to thank you, Mort, very much. It's very provocative. We could talk about that a long time, and I'd like to come back to it. But it's my pleasure now to introduce our honorary co-chair, James Leach. James Leach is the John Weinberg Visiting Professor of Public and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. He served as the interim director of the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, but as all of you know, he served in the Congress for 30 years as a representative. And those of us who had reason to go up to Congress on almost any issue of foreign policy always started with Congressman James Leach's office, because not only was he a source of encouragement and support on issues that mattered, he was always available for wise advice on what was feasible and possible. And most of all, he was always a voice for principled American foreign policy. He was for multilateralism even when it wasn't popular. A great leader and a great inspiration to so many people. And we're very, very honored that you were the co-chair for this conference, and we're delighted to have you with us to make some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, and I'll be very brief. I know the end of conferences, we all want to leave, but let me suggest perspective is really difficult to apply to issues of the day. And UN issues I've often found sometimes get tiring. But if you look at American history, it's interesting to think through that as a society, we have a lot of ambivalence. And it's between kind of an internationalism and a hubristic go-it-aloneism. It's between a isolationism and the sharing of global responsibilities. And isolationism and go-it-aloneism aren't the same thing, as this last administration showed. And neither is internationalism and refusal to use force. I mean, as we all know, Wilson and FDR are two great propitiators of international organizations after leading great wars. I want to mention, though, that if you think through the partisanship dimensions, there in one sense aren't any. I remember in the 80s we had a Democratic mayor of New York calling the UN a cesspool. We had a Republican ambassador at the UN saying he wanted to wave goodbye to the delegates. On the other hand, there are some partisan elements that are very deep right now. And in the political party I belong to, historically there have been divisions between conservatives and liberals and sometimes moderates, but the dominance in the Republican Party today is by movement Republicans that have three opinions, and the public has missed them. There's a sense for two, but not the third. The three opinions are you have to be pro-life, pro-tax cut, and anti-UN. And there is this thing out there that is so bizarre. Of all the issues I've ever heard about in terms of talking to people that I have the most difficult time comprehending, are people that are very concerned for American sovereignty and think it's jeopardized at the drop of a hat. And this word sovereignty is a great concern of some people, and it's perplexing, but it's not, whether it's intellectually right or wrong. The intriguing phenomenon is the lack of intellectual consistency. For example, the people that are very concerned for American sovereignty are now talking about secession. And how you can put those two concepts in the same breath, I don't know. But it's a real interesting phenomenon. In addition to differences in American history, we all have to recognize we have our own internal tensions, that we can differ sometimes whether we should be involved somewhere or not involved. I mean, these are judgmental circumstances. My favorite contrast was within a man that was very important to our history, a man named Ronald Reagan. In Reagan's first term, he was the most anti-arms control president in American history, and he was very anti-UN. Indeed, I remember in about 1982, a young man came to my office who had been a White House worker bee and informed me that he was visiting me because he'd been appointed to Princeton's job. He was to be the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. And I asked him what his marching orders were. And he said to me, we have decided, I don't know who the we is, this is the coffee clutch at the White House, I guess, to get out a whole series of new UN agencies. And I said, well, like what? Well, we're going to lead with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I said, well, why would you want to do that? And he said, well, you know, the Russians play too big a role. We can't have an agency work in which the Russians and we are co-chair. I mean, how preposterous. Well, anyway, I took him very seriously, and shortly after he left, meaning minutes or seconds, I called up a couple of friends at State and told them about Republican lingo, which was about cost-benefit analyses of things, and write a paper on cost-benefit analysis of getting out of IAEA and do it quickly because this is on the order. Well, instead of getting out of the IAEA, we decided to get out of the least dangerous international organization ever created. And it's called UNESCO. And there were a series of reasons. I mean, UNESCO had some rhetoric that was anti-Israel, and it had some people proposing some sort of rules for journalists, and it didn't have very good financial structure. But it has to operate, all decisions are by consensus. So if one's anti-anything, it doesn't matter if the United States is there. And the intriguing thing, that one country that didn't want us to get out was Israel. The one country that did was France. And it was awkward. Anyway, in the second term, Reagan shifted. And I had led a House debate on the nuclear freeze. And we were in the arms control movement. We were strongly for what was called the SALT agreement, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And suddenly, the President of the United States preempted we weak liberals, who was really saying this was a preposterous notion, and he announced he was favoring START, which means Strategic Arms Reduction, which is vastly more progressive than limitation. And so the president really did an about turn. And I remember thinking it was a rhetorical nonsense. My first reaction, and luckily I didn't say that to anyone, because it ended up, presidents are generally pretty sincere. And he was very sincere. And this was a president who changed positions. Normally, in presidential politics, you get changes of policy based upon changes of administrations, people, often heavily between parties. In this case, we had the same person, same party with a change. And on the UN, very intriguingly, if you look at the budgets that Ronald Reagan submitted to the United States Congress, they were larger budgets than the democratically controlled Congress eventually passed. And so I give Reagan real credit for sincerity. And then he had a third term. I don't know if any of you know about Reagan's third term. Well, as an ex-president of the United States, he gave a speech at Oxford University in which he came out for a rapid deployment force. In other words, the conservative leader that you hear everyone claiming he's my man came out for a rapid deployment force, and I found that frankly quite interesting. As far as UN reform, I'm not on the same path as some of the judgments around here, although I understand the judgments. I am one who thinks that there are lots of things that need to be reformed in big institutions all the time, but seldom has a case for expanding the Security Council been more totally compelling, and there is no reason that it cannot be done. And I am one who thinks that at the right time this administration should lead strongly on the issue. My own personal views, and these are different than everybody else's, that not only can you expand with a few principal countries and probably expand with some regional countries, that you might have some alternative arrangements. For example, you could have a trade-off every 3 terms between Indonesia, Pakistan, and Egypt, for instance, as just an automatic, even conceivably between, well, some other situations. But now the downside to that, and I'm going to tell you an anecdote, but I just had to think about it when I was writing some notes to myself. In my first term in Congress, I bore a great burden. I was a moderate Republican, and at the time, and I got more cynical as I got older, but that's what age does. But I felt that the burden of a moderate Republican was always to have a constructive alternative to every Democratic proposal. And I was the ranking member of an all-powerful subcommittee called Historic Preservation and Coinage of the House Banking Committee. And it was a 5-member subcommittee, of which there were 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. About the smallest subcommittee I know of and the least important. But all of a sudden, we were confronted with a new issue. And the issue was, should we have a coin, a new dollar coin, and a bill had been introduced for a Susan B. Anthony dollar. And I'm thinking to myself, where's my constructive Republican alternative? And so I came in one day and I announced that I had an alternative, and I'd recalled that from living in Britain that I'd once seen a European coin, I forget just what country, that had 2 people on it juxtaposed from angles. So one was angular on top of the other, and so my bill was the Susan B. Anthony Harriet Tubman coin. And the chairman of the subcommittee was a man from the District of Columbia named Walter B. Fauntleroy. Under the Constitution of the United States, until this last month, no one from the district could vote on the House floor, but you could serve on committees and be chairman of committees and subcommittees. And so Walter was the chairman, and I went to Walter and I suggested that he might like the idea, and he immediately did. And I figured that the rule of the House is you get a subcommittee to vote for something, and the full committee follows and the House accepts. Well, anyway, we came to the last hearing on the subject, and in the audience was or testifying was a lady named Eleanor Smeal, who was head of, I think it was NOW, it was called National Organization of Women. And she looked up at me and in a less than friendly way, and she said, how many people had endorsed my bill? And I said, well, I just kind of wrote it myself. I hadn't asked anyone to endorse it. And she listed all these organizations that supported the Anthony coin, and if you added the organizations together, it was like 140 million Americans. And she said, well, it's 140 million to 1. I said, well, that's a pretty fair statistic. And then she just looked at me and she just, I mean, I don't want to use the verb snarled, but she said, you're just like all those men. You think it takes 2 women to equal a man. At that point, I knew that my constructive alternative was probably not likely to go very far. And as we walked out, Walter got me aside and he said, Jim, will you do me a favor? And I said, what's this? He said, well, the speaker called me in today and he said, you know, we're going with the Anthony coin. And I said, well, I assume that and I'd be happy to help him, but he said, but please don't tell any of my constituents. So I'm just thinking of that alternative if you do a juxtaposed country to country. Does it take 2 countries to equal 1? I hope people would think of that as a positive, not a negative. Anyway, for most of our history, despite ambivalence, the arc of the American experience has been generally progressive. And if we look at the UN, I've always thought the key is that there are a lot of programs, a lot of chatter, a lot of things that don't get done, but most things that do get done are positive. And the way to look at the UN is not that it failed to do something, but that sometimes it does help. And the whole challenge is to hope that it works for a longer and more constructive period. One of the ironies of the Bush years is that opposition to the United States became very great, and one of the aspects of it is that it caused many other countries in the world to become more pro-UN. And that is oddly a constructive result. I mean, and we should not look at that as something that shouldn't be taken advantage of. And so let me just conclude with the notion that I think people err if they think of the UN as bricks and mortars. They err if they think of what the UN hasn't done. And it's done some fairly constructive things, and the question is how do you organize to make it do better? But also, the UN is basically an ideal, and it is an absolute, utter mistake not to equate idealism and realism. And I want to be very precise on this. In the last 8 years before the Obama election, America came under the grips in foreign policy of a group of people that represented a very small number. In the year 2000, I don't think there were more than 200 or 300 neocons in the world. And yet they came to control American foreign policy, and the theme was, we're realists. Well, I think the great distinction is between realism and pseudo-realism. And when you hear what used to be remarked upon, and I would hear it more than most of you because I was an inside Republican, how realistic it is that we should go against the views of everybody else. How realistic it is that we don't need to exactly comply with the constraints of law that others have to comply with because we're the world's only superpower. But if you think about it, what is more realistic than trying to expand the rule of law? And if you ask any American group in any setting, almost anywhere, would you prefer to work in alliances or alone? It's a unanimous virtual decision. Everybody prefers alliances. What is more conservative than expanding the rule of law? And so just in an idea sense, let me just end with one notion. In political science, there was this abstract set of feelings that were introduced as political theory, led by a guy named Thomas Hobbes, who described this view of what's called a state of nature, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. And I always thought that was pretty bizarre because it was pretty unrealistic. not recognizing what the Middle East has become. But for Hobbes, there was also a notion you could have civilization, but you couldn't get there because of you couldn't get out of this state of nature. And then Jefferson's philosophical godfather, who was John Locke, started to describe a state of nature and civil society. And the distinction between civil society and a state of nature, that is civilization and a state of nature, were two phenomena: rules to govern disputes and third-party arbitration. And what in heaven's name do we have to concern ourselves about if we want to have a civilized world? It's rules to govern disputes and third-party arbitration. And what the UN kind of points to as and Americans don't look at it this way, that in surprising numbers of ways, international law is developing in trade, in arms control, the post office. I mean, there are rules that you develop because you have to deal with things. And then there are new issues, whether they be the environment, terrorism, whatever. Do you want to have legal approaches, and then how do you organize people together? And so the UN is there. It should always be criticized. There are problems that will inherently be with it, but it also can be used. And above anything else, it reflects an idealism that cannot be underestimated. And idealism is realism. Thank you.
You could not have closed this on a better note, James, and I'm very grateful to you, and grateful to all of you for being here, and to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this meeting. I'm sorry that we have to move from here now because they have another meeting that they're doing. But again, James, thanks so much. It was terrific, and we're very grateful.